I've been noticing a growing fascination and a sort of revival with Mexican clay pottery and crafts among millennial women on social media, especially Latinas living in the United States. And it goes beyond just dishes, cups, and pots. They've embraced a broader aesthetic, a home decor style rooted in Mexican and rustic details. People call it Mexican Modernism, Señora Life, Neo-Colonial Mexican, Hacienda style, and so on. It borrows cues from colonial design and applies them to modern spaces, striking a balance between functionality and warmth. The key materials are clay and ceramics. Think clay pottery and talavera. Solid wood, present in doors and furniture. Stone like cantera and basalt. Textiles like linen, cotton, jute, and leather for sofas and throw pillows. And the color palette leans earthy and warm. Terracotta, cream, ochre, and brown, accented with vibrant pops of pink, blue from Talavera Poblana, deep green, or black. Artisan crafts and religious art are staples of the decor. Talavera vases, ceramic pieces, devotional paintings, crosses, and of course plants and flowers everywhere. The overall effect is warm and a little maximalist, mostly because of all the textures and patterns we can find in a lot of pieces. Sure, some people take it over the top and it starts to feel like a caricature, but when it's done with respect and moderation, it's genuinely beautiful. Now back to the Mexican clay, which is the real subject of this video. For many of us millennials, these pieces are deeply nostalgic. They take us straight back to our grandmother's kitchens. The classic bean pot, Mexican spiced coffee, corn atole, mole poblano, the red chili pork. The clay dishes have traditionally been more common in restaurants than in everyday home use. But the mugs have been making a strong comeback, appearing not only in cafes, but increasingly in people's homes as well, simply because they're such beautiful pieces. This whole aesthetic movement has embraced clay cookware wholeheartedly for cooking, for serving, for morning coffee. And I think that's exactly where the problem starts. These pieces are being used daily in wrong ways. Like I was saying, our grandmothers, at least those from urban, non-native households, typically owned maybe 3 clay pieces, reserved for very specific recipes, partly because these aren't mass-produced items and they are expensive. But now I see people wanting to use them for everything. Mugs, dishes, pots, cazuelas, teapots, salsa dishes, pitchers, spoon rests, vases, the whole kitchen. And yeah, they're beautiful and authentic. But slow down. They are not the only way to style a Mexican-inspired home. And sadly, there's a very serious problem with using them in the kitchen. I'm not here to demonize these crafts or tell you stop buying them. Not at all. What I want is to shift the way we think about pottery, to understand that in most cases, it should be kept strictly decorative, and that's completely fine. It can actually have an even bigger presence in your home outside of the kitchen. The use of this pottery is a genuinely serious issue, because lead poisoning is irreversible. It accumulates in body tissue and is extremely difficult to eliminate. In children, it's even worse. They are far more vulnerable to lead exposure. They absorb a higher proportion of it than adults do. And because they are still developing, the damage can be permanent. Lead directly interferes with a child's cognitive development. High exposure has been shown to reduce IQ by as many as 5 points. It also causes difficulty with learning, attention, and memory, which shows up clearly in academic performance. And it's strongly linked to developmental delays and broader cognitive disabilities. Behavior-wise, lead exposure significantly raises the risk of ADHD, hyperactivity, aggression, irritability, and even violent tendencies. It can disrupt emotional and social development too. Prenatal exposure is particularly damaging. It can affect the fetal brain and nervous system, leading to lifelong behavioral and learning challenges. A person is considered lead poisoned when blood levels exceed 5 micrograms per deciliter. But the truth is, there is no safe level of lead in the blood. Any amount, no matter how small, is harmful. Beyond the nervous system, lead can also damage the kidneys, the endocrine system, the cardiovascular system, the reproductive system, the immune system, the liver, the gastrointestinal system, and it's linked to cancer. It does quite cumulative damage that creeps into your life slowly. Even today, Mexico is facing a lead poisoning crisis among children, and tragically, the communities hit hardest are indigenous children, those from low-income families, and children in small rural towns. A study published in the journal Salud Pública de México in 2018 by the National Institute of Public Health estimated that more than 1 million children in Mexico have elevated blood lead levels. In communities with fewer than 100,000 inhabitants, 22% of the children studied had levels above the limit set by the official Mexican standard, that is, above 5 micrograms per deciliter. In southern Mexico, the figure climbs to 26%, 1 in 4 children. In central Mexico, it was 20.7%, and in the north, 9.8%. The study also examined the link between glazed clay use and blood lead levels. It found that 35% of the population studied had used clay pottery in the previous 3 months, and the correlation was clear. The more frequently clay was used, the higher the blood lead levels. Only 11% of those with elevated lead levels had not used clay, while 46% confirmed they had. These children are already more vulnerable because of circumstances largely outside of their control. But those of us who do have access to information and better options really have no excuse. It will be genuinely reckless to expose ourselves or our children to lead just for aesthetics. It's not the clay itself that makes these pieces dangerous, it's the glaze or enamel applied to them. That shiny finish is made from a mixture of silica and lead oxide. It's used to seal the piece and make it heat resistant and waterproof, and to keep food from sticking. The problem is still very present today, because many artisan potters still use wood-fired kilns, and without precise temperature control, the enamel doesn't fully bond to the clay. Over time, and especially with heat, it starts to leach off, and you end up ingesting it. From what I understand, though I'm not entirely certain, the risk is higher when the pieces are used for cooking, because the heat accelerates the release, and also when used with acidic foods and drinks. Programs like Barro Fonart, and Per Earth have worked with potters since 1990s to develop lead-free glazes, but the problem hasn't been eliminated, and the safest approach is always to test your own pieces. One simple method: pour white vinegar into the piece and let it sit for 24 hours. If the surface loses its shine or leaves a white residue, it contains lead. Even if a piece is labeled lead-free, it doesn't hurt to verify. Still, my honest recommendation is to keep clay pieces strictly decorative, no kitchen use. And here's the broader truth: Mexican clay isn't the only thing contaminating us. It may contain more lead than most, but a troubling number of cookware items in our kitchens are silently harmful. The safest options for cooking are cast iron, stainless steel, titanium, and glass. Full stop. For utensils, stainless steel and wood, nothing else. Avoid non-stick coatings as much as possible. As of today, there is no non-stick surface that can be considered truly safe. They all still use compounds from the PFAS group. Same goes for aluminum, plastic, and silicone. Silicone was heavily promoted as a safe alternative for a while. But the reality is we don't know enough yet. Silicone can release siloxanes, which may disrupt the endocrine system or affect fertility. Better to wait until the research is clearer. These same considerations apply to anything that comes into contact with food. Replace plastic cutting boards with wood or stainless steel. Use glass containers instead of aluminum foil for storing food. Avoid aluminum in cooking altogether. Dishes and mugs are an even more complicated conversation, because most ceramic pieces also use glazes and paints that can contain lead and cadmium. These metals can leach into food and drinks, a process called lixiviation, and it happens faster when the pieces come into contact with acidic substances or high heat. The risk is higher with vintage pieces made before 1980, when lead-based glazes were standard. It's also higher with imported or artisan ceramics, where there are no regulated standards or controlled firing temperatures. And bright colors, red, oranges, yellows, are more likely to contain lead and cadmium. Also worth noting, decorative dishes are almost never food safe. They are display only. For everyday dishes, look for stoneware, a dense, durable ceramic that typically doesn't require toxic glazes. Porcelain, glass, stainless steel, or bamboo. Always checking that any glaze used is food safe. When shopping, get into the habit of checking the chemical disclosure, because it's very easy to think you're making a better choice and still end up with something harmful. For example, I came across a chemical disclosure for the Mainstays cast iron skillet, a generic Walmart brand. It's much cheaper than its competitors, and you can see why. If you invest a little more in a reputable specialized brand, it's absolutely worth it. Cast iron skillets are practically indestructible. They last generations. I have a full set and that's all I cook with now, even if food sticks sometimes and I have to reseason it constantly. It's still better than buying a new Teflon pan every 6 months that harms your health and starts sticking almost immediately. With cast iron, you can scrub hard, use metal utensils, and the pan won't budge. Burnishing or bruñido is one of the pre-Hispanic techniques used to waterproof clay. It involves carefully and repeatedly rubbing the surface of the piece with a mineral stone called pyrite until the pores close, preventing liquid from seeping through. The pieces were then decorated with slips, engobes, made from colored clays and minerals. This technique dates back to the earliest inhabitants of Tonalá, Jalisco, Tecoca and Tecuexe people, who lived there from at least the 16th century. Then came the Spanish Conquest, and with it the lead glaze technique, which not only waterproofs the clay but also makes it resistant to heat. And it has remained the dominant method in clay pottery production ever since. Sadly, the health risk is difficult to eliminate given the nature of how these pieces are made. But again, I'm not saying we should stop buying or supporting these crafts. I'm saying we should stop using them in the kitchen. They're beautiful objects full of history and meaning, and I hope they never disappear. There's also an ongoing debate around buying artisan crafts from large retail chains versus local shops. The concern is that some products, even authentic ones, were acquired by exploiting the artisans or are outright copies. I saw a lot of recommendations for clay pieces from Home Goods and TJ Maxx, followed by criticism that these are mass-produced goods that don't support artisans. But here's the thing. Buying from a local artisan shop or a boutique doesn't automatically mean the artisan is being fairly compensated. This market often works in deeply exploitative ways. In many cases, you're buying from a middleman who haggled the artisan down to almost nothing, then resells at full price or more, pocketing the difference. Here are some examples of exploitation and cultural appropriation by major brands. In 2015, Nestlé launched a line of mugs for their Abuelita hot chocolate brand featuring designs from the Tenango's tradition. Colorful illustrations that reflect the worldview of the Otomi Tepehua indigenous community from Hidalgo. These designs are typically embroidered onto textiles, and that embroidery is one of the primary sources of income for hundreds of indigenous people in Tenango de Doria. Two artisans filed a criminal complaint against Nestlé for alleged plagiarism, pointing to designs strikingly similar to their own registered work: a deer, a hummingbird, and an armadillo. What made the case particularly significant is that those designs had already been registered with Mexico's National Institute of Copyright, along with over 10,000 other pieces created by 15 artisans. Nestlé never asked for permission, never credited the community, and never offered any compensation. As with any artwork, a piece holds legal protection from the moment it's created, and artisans can register their work to protect it, even if companies argue that these are centuries-old techniques passed down through generations and therefore belong in the public domain. Legal experts agree that Mexican authorities need to do more to promote geographic indications and strengthen protections through both the Institute of Copyright and the Mexican Institute of Industrial Property, so that this kind of appropriation can't happen without credit, permission, and fair payment to the communities involved. More recently, Mexican-American designer Willy Chavarria designed the Adidas Oaxaca slip-on sneaker. The sole is borrowed from the 1990s Adidas model, and the upper features a woven pattern strikingly similar to the traditional Oaxacan huarache sandal, a craft made by Zapotec artisans. When the shoe was released, politicians accused Adidas of cultural appropriation. President Claudia Sheinbaum stated publicly that Adidas and other companies were appropriating the creative work of indigenous communities. The Oaxacan state government initiated negotiations with Adidas to secure compensation for the indigenous communities whose intellectual property had been used. This ultimately pushed Willy Chavarria to issue a public apology, and Adidas released a statement. The problem wasn't the intent, honoring Oaxacan culture, but the execution. There was never a real collaboration with the artisans from the start, no compensation, and no credit. And then there's an example of collaboration that happened, but was deeply unfair. French designer Christian Louboutin launched a collection of bags called Mexicaba, made in collaboration with indigenous women from the Yucatan Peninsula. Each woman was paid 237 Mexican pesos per bag. The bags sold for 28,000 pesos each. More than 40 communities participated, producing 2,000 embroideries, and they were also the faces of the ad campaign without compensation. The most recent example that went totally viral is the Adidas Mexico jerseys for the 2026 World Cup, which were embroidered by 150 Nahua artisans from Naupan, Puebla. Just to be clear, I'm only sharing what's been reported in the media. A lot of the backlash actually started with an influencer named Luz Valdez, who shared claims from anonymous sources, supposedly artisans and ex-employees of Someone Somewhere, the Mexican company that teamed up with Adidas for this project. Unfortunately, there aren't any reliable sources out there, and it looks like the artisans themselves can't really talk about their working conditions because they signed a pretty unfair contract. Someone Somewhere is a Mexican B Corp that connects rural artisans with steady, project-based work to help them get out of poverty. Their whole thing is designing clothes and accessories that are easier to scale. They use more generic designs. Actually, word is that the embroidery patterns for the jerseys were designed using AI, so the final product is cheaper for the consumer. But this also means they're constantly retraining artisans and limiting them to basic modern embroidery styles instead of respecting their ancestral techniques and patterns. Their argument is that traditional methods drive prices up and make things harder to sell, and that they want to make production easier for the artisans. It looks like they're making production easier, not necessarily boosting their income. They usually team up with big names like Delta Airlines, Lacoste, and now Adidas. On paper, it sounds amazing. Someone somewhere offers artisans steady work, international exposure, and takes care of all the distribution and logistics. Plus, they set up workshops, provide all the raw materials, and make sure artisans only have to focus on making their art with guaranteed income. But there are a few things we just can't ignore. The biggest issue here is that rural artisans in Mexico are already dealing with a lot of systemic vulnerability and social marginalization. It's a cycle made worse by a history of poor access to education and money, plus a total lack of government support to protect their rights. Because of this, they are pretty much left out and don't have the legal or social tools to defend themselves. In this specific case, the company considers them independent suppliers, not employees, which means they didn't get any benefits. On top of that, one of the community leaders mentioned they negotiated the Adidas contract without any lawyer around to back them up. According to Luz Valdez, someone somewhere had the artisan sign a super strict, bulletproof contract. It basically bans them from making any public statements about how the clothes were made or claiming any direct business relationship with Adidas for at least 5 years. Plus, they had to give up the rights to their own names and faces for advertising, completely for free. The other thing is that these projects are usually massive, and there just aren't enough hands to handle the workload without it turning into an exploitative environment. I can't say for sure, I'm just guessing here, but the volume is just way too high for handmade production. In this case, word is they were only paid for 2.5 hours per jersey, because that was the expectation of how long each piece should take. But some artisans said it actually took them up to 8 hours to finish one, meaning all that extra time was completely unpaid. And the stat that really got people mad was that the artisans were supposedly being paid between 25 and 36 pesos per hour, which is about 288 pesos a day. That's actually less than the minimum wage in Mexico, which is around 315 to 440 pesos a day. Now imagine that on top of that, they probably weren't even getting paid for all their actual hours, but rather by production volume, like I mentioned before. Meanwhile, the jerseys dropped at a price tag somewhere between $90 and $285. This means the artisan only gets about 2.5% of the jersey's value, while the middleman pocket the remaining 97.5%. That is definitely not fair trade. If you really want to lift these artisans out of poverty, they should be getting at least 20 to 30%. Fairness means respecting that handmade work takes time, and every single hour needs to be paid right, meaning well above the country's minimum wage. That's exactly why handicrafts are expensive. It's not factory manufacturing where you can pump out hundreds of pieces in an hour. Each piece is unique, it's a form of artistic and cultural expression, and its value goes way beyond just the product itself. In my opinion, if all of this turns out to be true, someone somewhere comes off as a majorly hypocritical and abusive B Corp. They market themselves as this ethical, responsible company that's all about fair trade, preserving ancient traditions, and being eco-friendly by cutting carbon emissions. But if this case is real, it's the exact opposite. It's taking advantage of vulnerable communities just because they can pay them dirt cheap without any consequences, forcing modern techniques and AI designs on them, and then waving the social responsibility flag. But here's the twist. I read an article in the New York Times by Jack Nicas and Luis Antonio Rojas, who seemed to be the first journalists to actually visit the workshop and talk to the women in Naupan. And it turns out the artisans completely contradicted the exploitation narrative. They had nothing but positive things to say, that they were happy with the work, loved the flexible hours, and felt they were getting paid better. They mentioned that nobody else had even bothered to visit them. For these women, social media activism and threats to cancel the brand aren't justice at all. It's a huge risk of losing their livelihoods, and that's the ultimate paradox. For them, this job is still a blessing, even if by outside standards it looks like exploitation. This just shows that nobody is really trying to fix the root of the problem. Everything has been pretty surface level. It doesn't fix the issue, it's just a band-aid. Honestly, there are just too many interests at play for things to change. Plus, I personally think this should be the government's responsibility, not just on the employers or middlemen, because they only take advantage of the fact that there are no real politics or laws protecting these communities. Even so, there's a lot of room for improvement here without making radical changes. For starters, we could make radical transparency mandatory whenever brands use the artisanal label. They should have to break down exactly how much the raw materials cost, how much went to labor, the logistics, and how much the brand pocketed. Another thing could be getting government support to provide legal arbitration whenever they deal with corporate giants. And as for the middlemen, they need to shift the relationship from a charity sweatshop vibe, where they feel like they are doing the artisans a favor by giving them work, to a fair business partnership. That means actually valuing and respecting their ancestral knowledge, their time, and their cultural impact. So when it comes to consuming artisan crafts ethically, the question isn't just about chain store or local boutique. It's about doing a little research. Where does the piece actually come from? How was it made? Is there a retailer or intermediary with a fair trade model that genuinely compensates the artisans? A useful red flag. If the price seems surprisingly low for a handmade artisan piece, something's off. Either it's industrially made or someone along the supply chain is being exploited. As I saw discussed on social media, TJ Maxx and Home Goods do carry a lot of imported goods, so the best approach is to check for certifications, labels, or any information about origin and production method. None of us can be perfect consumers, and we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves, but we also shouldn't feed the gentrification of artisan culture by buying cheap imitations that display the real thing. If you can't afford authentic artisan pieces, and they can be expensive, simply buy less. It's about being more conscious, not being perfect. There are so many beautiful ways to incorporate clay and Mexican crafts into your home beyond kitchen use. Idea 1. The dining table. Use a solid wood table dressed with an authentic Mexican embroidered table runner. Add a talavera base as a centerpiece with fresh flowers, a few candles in black clay holder, or whichever style you prefer, and a palm leaf tortillero. Keep the dishes and glazes simple. Clear glass with a subtle rim detail or light texture, and the stainless steel cutlery. The crafts do the visual work. The tableware stays clean and safe. Idea 2. The kitchen counter. Group your salt, pepper, and olive oil on a talavera or wooden tray, mixing in ceramic, glass, or wooden accents. Display your wooden cutting boards as part of the decor. If you use a lot of garlic, make salsas, or love guacamole, a beautiful molcajete becomes a natural countertop centerpiece. Or use an enamelware container as a base. Idea 3. Coffee mugs. I know the clay mugs are the magic pieces. They are the ones everyone wants. But you can find beautiful alternatives. Glass cups, stoneware with non-toxic glazes, or if you do want clay, make sure it's certified lead and heavy metal free. Pair them with wooden, clay, or talavera coasters for that extra touch. Idea 4. Cast iron cookware. Cast iron pans are visually stunning. Their texture and neutral color fit the aesthetic perfectly, and they are also one of the safest and most durable cooking options. They go from stovetop to oven to grill. Yes, they need a little extra care, but they're worth every bit of it. Idea 5. Architectural details. Think bigger. Clay floor tiles, roofing tiles, and celosias, lattice screens can completely transform a space, adding character and a warm natural tone. Or use talavera tile in specific focal points, like on a staircase for a bold, stunning accent. Idea 6. Planters and vases. Planters are the easiest way to define a style. Clay or talavera pots in all sizes look gorgeous with plants on a patio, in a living room, on the stairs, anywhere. And for vases, imagine a large statement piece at your entryway, or a more proportionate one as a coffee table centerpiece. Idea 7. Textiles and wall decor. In the living room, bring in an authentic Mexican textile, a straw pillow covers or a wall hanging. Add a discreet sacred art piece or a painting that complements the palette and textures. In the courtyard or outdoor space, talavera wall decorations, animals, cantaritos, and clay suns and moons are classic and timeless. What I'm really getting at is this: dishes, glasses, and cookware should be made from the cleanest, most paint-free materials possible, and the texture, color, and soul of Mexican style can come from everything around them. Table runners, decorative pieces, artwork, plants, tiles. The possibilities are endless. Part of what makes this aesthetic work is restraint. Not every single object needs to be clay. The beauty comes from balance, mixing textures and materials without going overboard. And this conversation goes beyond clay pots. There's so much in our kitchens that quietly harms us, with very little public awareness about it. Those dishes with lead and cadmium glazes, that scratched Teflon pan you've been meaning to replace for 2 years. So keep enjoying Mexican crafts and artisanship. Just rethink where they live in your home, and start paying more attention to the everyday kitchen items that actually touch your food. Let me know in the comments, do you love this style? Do you have clay pieces at home? And how do you use them? Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.